Thank you for coming along to our panel event on the right to disconnect. We're really excited about this one. We've got some great speakers lined up for you today. We're going to run it. The 4 speakers will speak, and then we'll leave plenty of time for panel discussion, Q&A, towards the end. So today, speaking first is Andrew Pakes, who is the Research Director and a Deputy General Secretary at Prospect Union, a union that represents over 150,000 members across tech, specialist, engineering and professional roles. Andrew leads Prospect's work around tech, AI, data rights and the future of work. So he's going to be giving us a union perspective on the prospect of a UK right to disconnect. Then we're going to go to Sacha Sokhi, who is a solicitor in the employment law team at Irwin Mitchell. Sacha acts for a variety of professionals and senior executives and advises on all areas of employment law. So Sacha's going to give us a legal perspective on what a UK right to disconnect might mean. Then we're going across the pond to Dr. Caroline Murphy, who's a lecturer in employment relations at the University of Limerick. She's also a visiting research fellow at Digit. She's the director of MSc and HRM at the Kenny Business School in Limerick, and she lectures in employment relations and human resource management. And Caroline is going to talk to us about the impact of technology on workers in the finance sector in Ireland and Ireland's relatively newly introduced right to disconnect model. And then finally, we're going to Umberto Bacchi, who's a correspondent at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. And Umberto is based in Tbilisi in Georgia. Umberto's work focuses on digital rights, and he's going to talk to us about the broader UK landscape of right to disconnect discussions. So yes, I'll pass on first of all to Andrew, please.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that, Esme. Can someone just wave and say you can hear me all right?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Let me share my screen. Is that sharing okay for everyone as well?
Perfect.
Brilliant. I feel like I'm a winner already. Well, look, firstly, I'm really pleased to join you in something that's been a bit different for me. I'm actually joining you from a live in-person event. So we've got the first meeting of our key worker representatives in person for about 18 months. So I'm sat in the foyer of a building with about 60 key shop stewards in the room next to me. So I popped out for that, where right to disconnect, the whole world of digital transformation, both for safety during COVID, but also what it means for us has been discussed this morning. So I've got a few slides, and I'm really pleased to be doing the warm-up act, let's put it that way, as the first speaker, because all 3 of the other speakers have been real inspirations for me and us as a union during this last 2-year period as champions of all of these issues. But right to disconnect, really, it's a union issue for us. It's something we were beginning to look at before COVID, with this blurring between private lives and home lives. And that's really been put into sharp relief during this COVID crisis. So I've got about 7 to 8 minutes where I put together just a bit of the storyboard about the issues we look at as practitioners in this field, negotiators around the right to disconnect, that kind of digital always on culture, some of the responses that unions are looking at, and then hopefully that tees it up for your 3 next speakers to look at. So firstly, why do we talk about this as an union issue? And I put some of these one of these might be Umberto's, who's covered these issues really well for us. We were really looking at these issues around the blurring lines and how devices like this, our mobile phones, laptops and others, were transforming the work relationship prior to the pandemic. But we've definitely seen some of that turbocharged, both in terms of the always on culture, which we'll talk about particularly today, but also digital surveillance, the ability of software to introduce control mechanisms for workers if they're working remotely or hybrid, as opposed to just in the office. And the reason we talk about this is because for the last 3 years, whenever we've done member surveys or opinion polling, this always on culture, the ability to switch off, the incidence of well-being, digital well-being, has always ranked really highly in terms of our members' experiences. And talking to the likes of Unison in the healthcare and public services, but also the FDA, as in more senior civil servants, it's been a real issue. And we represent members who are some public service, but also largely private sector, but also around 25,000 members who are freelance, self-employed members working in the creative industries predominantly, where always on culture and working beyond your contractual hours as a freelancer is really, really important, but actually slightly different to what it is as an employee. So this is an issue we care about. When we've done surveys, and I put three of the latest things around it, one of our worries is we're moving from this old-fashioned debate around presenteeism in the office is over into this new debate around digital presenteeism. You might be able to work in different locations, but this leash to your workspace is still there. So when we did the first one is on here is a survey from Aviva, which showed 44% of employees they surveyed during the pandemic, so they couldn't completely switch off. Second one is us, which is just over a third of people who used to work normally in an office who now have been working remotely or mixed during the pandemic have said their mental health has been affected. Combined with this, 1 in 5 companies now in the UK, the latest survey say, are already using some form of digital surveillance or monitoring software, which is that kind of thing that makes or adds to that pressure point. We also know that these longer hours, this kind of always on culture was something that affected home workers before the pandemic. This is the ONS's figures where they took a longer term look at home working, which bled a little bit into the start of the crisis. And it said there were a number of detriments if you were a home worker compared to full-time or office-based workers. And that was this pressure point to be working longer hours. And working longer time, but also this sense that the reality of less likely to be promoted, less likely to be there. And that's some of the pressure point about this idea that we're not just working longer, we feel we need to work longer because you don't want to miss out on an email from your manager, or if you fear you're going to be the last one to respond to it, will you then be regarded as a less productive worker than some of those who then respond quicker? So for us, this is part of a whole negotiation agenda for us around what does the new normal look like? If you remember back to the big words around build back better and the kind of Biden-esque slogans, in reality, what do they mean? And as a trade union, we've always been in favor of flexible and remote work. And we want to see this, we want to see this box here on the left around the benefits of what we can gain as workers maximized, but the risks managed. And I suppose our worry is that when you read a lot of the narrative in newspapers or the media, it tends to be around C-suite or the boardroom talking about flexibility is always good. It leads to all these good outcomes. We're saying that needs to be negotiated or measured, because we know that flexibility for some isn't flexibility for others. Also, it's not really flexible work if you're still feeling the pressure to respond outside of your normal hours and that pressure point. So this is the kind of the debit sheet we bring up with members and when we're thinking about negotiations. We also know, alongside the bigger discussion around what does hybrid working look like, what does the labour market look like coming out of this, that the digitalisation is something that's here and is going to continue. And I thought this was a really interesting slide from last year, just over a year ago, from the World Economic Forum, that asked employers what trends they saw as continuing. And I think this overwhelming evidence that digitalization is going to continue is really important in that. Let me skip that and go on to this. So that's led us to talk about with employers the right to disconnect. I think Caroline may take on this. We're taking this from the kind of Irish example. There's 3 elements to what we talk about and negotiate with government employers around this. Firstly, it's the right not to have to routinely perform work outside of normal working hours. So it's not about emails 9 to 5 to us. It's about, in your routine patterns of work, there's an expectation that when you're not working, you can stay not working and do the other things in life. Secondly, which is really important, it's not just a passive right, it also has to be a right not to be penalized, which is if you are routinely asked to work beyond it, what redress or matter of redress do you have through company policies, through law or elsewhere to actually challenge that? And then finally, it's around respect. And actually, this is all of us. We've done lots of work with our staff, with our rep and others, about how they respect each other's working patterns, and make this about individuals as well as collective. Three mechanisms that we look at. Enterprise bargaining is where we're currently at with employers. I probably do about two presentations to employer groups a week at the moment, either individual employers and groups, which is saying, can we put this into company policy as we think about what a hybrid policy framework may look like as you bring workers back or you measure that up? What is this? And that's the enterprise, so at company level. And that probably makes us distinct compared to some of the European, where you have more sectoral based industrial relations or broader policies. Then there's the more kind of directive approach, which is the French model, which some of those may talk about, which is an obligation on employers to negotiate. And we're quite attracted to this French plus approach in the UK. And then there's more prescriptive model, which is setting out the determinants of it. In terms of what we're asking for in terms of legislation, I think it's more the obligation for it. And we divide it into hard and soft. So clearly there's some really strict things that could be in policies, and I've listed some of these down there. Some of them we think don't work in most settings. So there are some German companies that auto-delete emails if you're outside of a working hour. We think for the members we represent, that's probably not right. But we feel there does need to be some policy negotiated and then characteristics set down there. And some of that can be about training and awareness raising we put in the soft box, but some of it's hard. And for us, hard means that there needs to be enterprise level company policy on this signed up by the leadership. And we would prefer that obligation for scale to be put onto business themselves in terms of looking at an amendment to the employment bill, if and when it ever appears, would be our preference around that. So what kind of union issues are we addressing in this? The issues that we negotiate on around right to disconnect are around performance management or surveillance, particularly this idea that if you don't respond outside of your normal working hours, will that then show up in terms of later bonus payments, performance payments? Well, actually, Esme responded really quickly. Andrew, you don't respond as quick. How does that get a sense of the management culture for it? Flexibility for who? We would say as a union, this should always involve worker voice, whereas too many of the policies around hybrid working are being imposed downwards on employees rather than upwards. But also there's some really important issues around impact on equality, diversity, inclusion. If you think through the traditional burden of care and how that falls predominantly on women in the labour market, this idea that if you're not always on because you're caring, then you could be marked down or regarded as less productive, I think brings through this different forms of traditional discrimination in a remote setting and how digital puts that. And I think that's a really interesting thing around not just control, but about the direct or indirect forms of discrimination that could come on that. Quickly to wrap up where we're making progress, Umberto may talk about this, but we work through Uni Global Union and our global federations. We know there's some really good international progress, different countries. Reading yesterday that Colombia's Senate has agreed policy on this. So there's different countries on top of Ireland, France, the EU, some MEPs looking at it. There's a range of countries looking at this, but we're also, despite the world of Brexit, still involved in company policies such as Telefonica, where we're the UK recognised union, where companies have agreed EU-wide or Works Council-wide agreements. So there are some big companies in the UK which are already signed up to right to disconnect policy, and we're learning from that to how we extend it to others. BEIS has got its flexible working task force. We haven't succeeded in forcing right to disconnect in there, but we have got them, and the government and ministers have recognised that the digital disconnect and non-work time versus work time is an issue that government needs to raise to, and that's really important. Within flexible working, digital disconnect is now an aim of BEIS policy to seek to mitigate that. Really importantly for us, we have the Scottish Fair Work Convention and the Scottish First Minister have both signed up to Right to Disconnect. And finally, we've got some English-wide policy. We've got recently the Work Foundation and Chartered Management Institute put out its policy around hybrid working, which suggested that companies should look at company-wide Right to Disconnect policies. So there's a whole range of things there, from international through to company level, that show we're making some progress. I said our aim is to negotiate company level whilst lobbying for the likes of the Westminster government to bring in something at a wider level, such as a policy inclusion within the employment bill. I will finish that there, if that's okay for you, Esme.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. It's great to get a union perspective on these issues. We're going to move swiftly on to Sacha. If you'd like to share your screen, Sacha. Sacha's going to talk us through some of this from a legal perspective.
Thank you, Esme. Right, I'm hoping that's now sharing.
That's great, thank you.
Okay, I'm hoping you can all hear me and that's sharing. So in terms of, as Esme introduced me, I'm a solicitor Owen Mitchell, specifically employment, but I deal more with senior execs and the claimant side of things. I will be focusing on looking at the legal framework in the UK currently. So if we look at how far the current legislation goes in the UK, so we've got the Health and Safety at Work Act, and that really dictates that employers must protect the health and safety and welfare at work of all their employees, as well as also others on their premises, which include anyone from casual workers, self-employed, also clients and visitors and the general public. But it's important to note that these duties are qualified with the words as far as is reasonably practicable, and there's often a big question mark over what the extent of that is. The Act contains powers for the Health and Safety Executive to enforce these employer duties and to enforce penalties for non-compliance. And breaching health and safety regulations can amount to a criminal offence, with the maximum penalty for failure to comply being, on summary conviction, 6-month imprisonment, and on indictment a penalty of 2 years imprisonment, but also a fine or both indeed. And in practice, employers really need to provide a safe place for workers, whether they're home workers, whether they're office workers. And these include steps like workstation assessments and discussions around additional support required to maintain health and safety, but also well-being. And the issue is with the health and safety at work regulations and the Acts at present is that establishing breach of these duties is often it's often got quite a high bar, and alone they don't amount to a right to disconnect. Now, if we move on to the working time regulations, these provide workers with a range of health and safety protections, including daily and weekly rest breaks and statutory holiday. Now, in line with the requirements of the regs, employers should ensure that workers take a minimum of 5.6 weeks of annual leave in each year. 4 weeks must usually be taken in that leave year, which it relates to. I say usually because we've recently, in 2020, legislation was passed due to the coronavirus to permit employers to carry over an unused portion of this if they were unable to due to the effects of the coronavirus. Now, under the regs, workers should take the following breaks or rest periods unless they're exempt. That includes 11 hours uninterrupted rest per day, 24 hours uninterrupted rest per week, and a rest break of 20 minutes when they're working more than 6 hours per day. And each worker's average working time, including overtime, should not exceed 48 hours per week. But as you may know, many employment contracts and agreements include an opt-out clause or a separate letter where employees can opt out of this as standard. Now, there's clearly an unequal bargaining position here at the point where you've got an employer and an employee, where the employee is commencing new employment and just obviously grateful to have found a new job. And many will agree to the opt-out provision without much thought, and often it's within the employment contract and they've not given it a second thought, really. And moving on to, I will just briefly touch upon this because I know other speakers are looking at this in more detail. So different jurisdictions have taken different approaches on implementing right to disconnect policies. And France has introduced legislation allowing employees to disconnect outside of the business's core hours. And then as a result, they won't suffer detriment, for example, like a pay rise or promotion for doing so. Their code came into effect in January 2017. However, the law there is quite vague, doesn't restrict after hours work communication, but it obliges organisations to negotiate the terms with prospective employees. Italy and Spain have similarly followed suit, and Germany have sought to tackle the issue by actually reaching an agreement with some employers to use technology to put in place software that actually restricts certain employees from accessing company emails on their smartphones between certain hours. And as you'll hear later as well, Ireland has recently brought in legislation covering the right to disconnect, in which their specific code covers 3 key rights which are established, which are that workers are entitled to not perform work or attend work matters outside of their normal working hours. They have a right not to suffer detriment for refusing to attend to work matters outside of normal working hours, and they have a duty to respect, both workers and employers have a duty to respect colleagues' right to disconnect. While the failure by an employer to follow the code isn't an offence in itself, the Ireland Code is now admissible in evidence in proceedings before the relevant courts. So that's actually useful for associated claims. So, for example, in the UK, this could assist with claims in the Employment Tribunal for whistleblowing, disability discrimination, different sorts of discrimination, for example. Ireland's code also interestingly covers workers in different time zones and acknowledges that some colleagues may be uncontactable at certain times during the day or have different working hours, and stipulates that working hours are not specifically defined. And it also looks at training as well to aid understanding of how the right to disconnect could be implemented, which is important. And then in India, you've got the Right to Disconnect Bill, which was introduced in 2018. And this proposed that no disciplinary action be taken if an employee does not respond to work-related calls after working hours. So in many respects, both within and outside of Europe, the UK appears to be behind in giving workers a legal right to disconnect. So if we look at some of the pitfalls of introducing a legal right to disconnect and what those could be. So for some in particular, those with childcare responsibilities, obviously the ability to work outside of traditional working hours provides much needed flexibility, and there is a risk that obviously preventing those employees working beyond a specific cut-off point may actually be a hindrance. Some do fear that preventing employees from accessing emails after hours has the undesirable effect of pressuring those employees to cram excessive amounts of work into the working day without taking adequate breaks. In addition, for employees who are in regional or perhaps international roles, there may be a real business need for work outside of the traditional 9 to 5 in order to effectively carry out those responsibilities. However, as we've seen from the Ireland example, this can all be acknowledged. If we do see a legal right to disconnect be introduced in the UK, it's likely we would see exemptions for certain industries, or indeed an opt-out provision such as that as the working time regs. And again, this would bring into question and the employee's bargaining power if there is, obviously this ability to opt out at the start of the employment relationship. So looking at what else employers could do in practice, even without a legal right to disconnect, there are steps that employers can, and some are to some degree taking in order to maintain the well-being of their staff, particularly since the pandemic, and since many were forced to work from home. So employers should have already started reviewing their policies on flexible working and remote working at the start of the pandemic, but it would be interesting to note how many of those specifically reference expectations regarding well-being and right for employees to disconnect. As Andrew said, flexibility for the worker is key as well. So it's important that also junior staff are given training on maintaining their well-being and offered support for their mental health. But equally, and perhaps more importantly, those in supervisory or managerial roles need to understand how to set reasonable expectations and ensure that junior staff are able to put their mental health and their well-being first. Interestingly, in 2019, there was a case brought by a Spanish trade union against Deutsche Bank, and that was brought in the European Court of Justice. And the ECJ actually ruled that employers must keep a record of all hours of their workers each day. The UK is not aligned with this, and only a few industries, such as the legal industry, track their employees' hours. And this has been debated as a potential solution, which ensures that those that work or wish to work flexibly can do so, whilst those who want to enforce their rights to disconnect can also do so. However, coming from an industry myself, where time recording is at the forefront of what we do and are expected to do, ensuring that every minute of your day is accounted for can be onerous. It can add added stress and can sometimes alienate workers as well if that's forced upon them. It is important that supervisors and managers as well use formal one-to-ones or some other space to deal with not only performance issues, but actually for workers to discuss their well-being issues as well, such as feeling overworked and pressurised to work outside of normal working hours or respond to emails. Understandably, though, employees may be hesitant to rock the boat, particularly if there's an absence of a legal right to disconnect as well. So even in the absence of a formal right, there are plenty of other measures that employers can and should be taking to avoid health and safety issues and burnout of their staff. The introduction of a legal right to disconnect would enforce and crystallise this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sacha. It's really good to get a legal perspective on these things. So we're going to go now to Caroline Murphy, who's going to talk to us about the Irish context and the right to disconnect, the guidelines that have been introduced over there. So over to you, Caroline.
Great, thanks, Esme. So yes, I'm going to talk about the right to disconnect in the Irish context. And as you'll see by the title of the presentation, I've named it Right to Disconnect, Unfinished Business. And the reason for that is, I suppose, even though we have introduced a code of practice on right to disconnect, I think there are still things and developments that need to occur in the Irish context in order to provide for sufficient and adequate protection for employees in seeking a right to disconnect. So looking at the right to disconnect, it's always worth considering where exactly it came from and what it emerged through. So Eurofound's definition of a right to disconnect really refers from employees being forced to engage with work and having the ability to refrain from engaging with work-related electronic communications outside of working hours. And it's interesting to put the emphasis on work-related communications, because certainly in the consultation process around right to disconnect and some of the narrative that was conducted in the media around here at the time, there was seeming, I suppose, differentiations put between what is considered work and what is considered simply consulting work in the evenings. So this idea of, if you look at an email, maybe that's not considered work, but if you respond to the email, then perhaps it is. And whether or not that is actually a fair differentiation. So it's always worth considering and going back to, well, what exactly does the right to disconnect mean? And I think that touches very much as well on when Andrew pointed out the difference between hard and soft approaches to a right to disconnect. So ultimately, what are we trying to achieve in giving employees more control and more ability to exercise a right to disconnect? We're trying to remove the growing situation of work extension, where people are ever more connected to their work, where they're ever expected to be more available to their employers. And this is a phenomenon that we saw growing ever before the pandemic, ever before the increase in remote and hybrid working. We saw work extension increasing. We saw time poverty as opposed to a leisure revolution being one of the significant outcomes of technological advancement. We've also seen as well very much this idea of always on work cultures being normalized. And it's interesting when we look at the idea of exemptions for sectors and industries and certain organizations within a right to disconnect, you know, they're often the ones which are the worst culprits when it comes to this normalized approach to an always on work culture. So multiple studies before the pandemic and throughout and since the pandemic have indicated a growing significance around workers' expectations to be available for work and their willingness, or sometimes unwillingness, but still engaging with responding to work demands outside of work time. So for example, Eurofound found that 27% of respondents when working from home reported working in their free time to meet work demands. And we saw multiple studies coming out in the Irish context around increased productivity since the pandemic measures around working from home and flexible working. So in this context, I suppose it's worth considering, where did the right to disconnect come from in the Irish context? Well, at the start of 2021, the European Parliament was certainly making indications that a right to disconnect directive or a more European all-encompassing piece of legislation might emerge around right to disconnect. And at that time, we saw France, Italy, Spain, to an extent Belgium had made moves in this regard. And now, of course, Portugal and Ireland have as well. But even in the absence of an actual European-wide directive, there are certain policies and directives on the ground in existence already that mean that there are elements of right to disconnect already referred to, whilst not necessarily being explicit. So for example, we have the European Pillar of Social Rights, Pillar 9 and Pillar 10, which was, you know, explicitly talk about work-life balance and health and safety in the working environment. The 2003 Working Time Directive that made very explicit expectations around maximum working hours and rest breaks. And the forthcoming EU Directive on Work-Life Balance for parents and carers, which will come into effect from August 2022, has certainly been influential, I think, in many governments making a step towards introducing something more explicitly around the right to disconnect. But in the Irish context, it was our Organisation of Working Time Act 1997, which came in for, I suppose, specific examination in this area, where many, both academics, trade unions, representative bodies, were claiming that in essence, the Organisation of Working Time Act was no longer fit for purpose, in that it wasn't making explicit reference to digital working and the new, more technology-driven ways of working that we're now all used to. So, in April of this year, April 1st, 2021, the Workplace Relations Commission here introduced a code of practice for employees and employers on the right to disconnect. And ultimately, this, I suppose, in many ways can be traced back to government commitments to increase flexible and remote working, and commitments they've made under the making remote work policies that were introduced since the pandemic. But equally, it was a piece of developments, I suppose, that was referenced in the programme for government in 2020. So right to disconnect was mentioned pre-pandemic back in around February, early March of 2020. Ultimately, though, I think it is the trade union that's most active in the finance sector here, the Financial Services Union, which ultimately I think can be seen as the the strongest and earliest advocates for a right to disconnect in the Irish context. I worked as part of a research group here at the University of Limerick with the Financial Services Union in 2019 on releasing a report on World Mental Health Day in October of that year. And within that, the union made a very specific call for the introduction for right to disconnect legislation. And we're currently working on the second of those reports. So we should see, I suppose, some pre and post outcomes on this early in 2022. So what has the code actually delivered for workers? Well, I think Andrew already pointed out some of the three things that are on the slide here. Ultimately, what the code promises to do, or what it says its aim is to provide a code of practice for employers and employees on the right to disconnect. And it talks very much about these three key areas: the right not to routinely be expected to work outside of normal working hours, the right not to be penalised for refusing to work outside of normal working hours as stipulated in your terms and conditions of employment, and thirdly, an expectation that employees respect both their own and each other's right to disconnect. So ultimately, what we have is a code of practice rather than a specific piece of legislation. And the purpose of the code really, I think, is there to give practical guidance and best practice examples to employers and employees in relation to right to disconnect. So some of the more specific things that it sets out are, firstly, it provides for detailed information on working hours. There's an expectation that employers will provide detailed information on working hours as per what they would always have done in the Terms of Employment Information Act 1994 to 2014. So there isn't really anything new in that, other than the fact that the right to disconnect code of practice is now really consolidating all of the different pieces of legislation where digital connectivity could potentially impact, and it's drawing all of those together in the code. The second thing it talks about in the code is the importance for employers to maintain adequate records of work and adequate records of rest breaks. Again, all of that is also covered in the Organisation of Working Time Act, and it's covered in the Employee Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2018. So again, nothing new there, but consolidating what we already have in existing legislation. Equally, in terms of compliance with the health and safety legislation, our existing Health, Safety and Welfare at Work Act 2005 was brought in and specifically referenced within the Code of Practice on right to disconnect. I suppose the most important one from an employer's obligations is right down the end here, where it's an obligation on an employer not to penalise any employee who attempts to assert their right to disconnect. Now, of course, the issue with this is the idea of, well, there's a difference from an employee's perspective between direct penalisation for exercising your right to disconnect and the potential and more difficult to prove indirect impact that it may have on your longer term career or on your bonuses, for example, from exercising your right to disconnect. Interestingly, too, there's a very significant emphasis placed on the individual employee's own expectations and own obligations around working time. So employees are asked to be aware of their expectations around working time, to manage their own working time properly, and to take care to protect their own health and safety at work. The Code of Practice also emphasises employees' role in respecting others' right to disconnect. So they talk about the importance of not getting into a routine of regularly email or calling your colleagues outside of working hours. And they stipulate that employees must cooperate fully with working time mechanisms as put in place by the employer. Now, interestingly, again, I suppose there's a concern around this one that when it comes to remote working and from working from home, for example, that some employers might potentially use the introduction of the right to disconnect code of practice as a way to actually introduce more invasive or more sophisticated forms of employee surveillance software in the home under the guise of complying with the right to disconnect legislation. Importantly, too, the Code of Practice outlines that employees must notify their employer in writing if they are unable to avail of rest breaks, and that they have to become conscious of their own working patterns and take remedial action where necessary. So again, when it comes back to the idea of, I suppose, providing guidance to employers, the code is prescriptive to an extent, but not overly prescriptive in what it recommends. So in line with the fact that the Code of Practice was jointly developed between the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and employer bodies, it does, of course, mirror that in recommending to employers that they consult with their employees or their employee representatives in developing a right to disconnect policy. They point out that any policy that is developed jointly should emphasize that there's an expectation that people do actually disconnect from work outside of working hours and working time. The policy does, of course, however, stipulate that there are occasional legitimate situations where it is necessary for staff to be contacted outside of working time. And the Code of Practice actually makes very specific examples here where it talks about things like to be available for rostering, to be available in unforeseen circumstances, where an employer might need to contact somebody for operational reasons. And it's interesting too that there have been some who have criticised the wording of the Code of Practice for being a little bit, I suppose, too broad in this regard, where existing legislation, like, for example, the Organisation of Working Time Act, would actually have been much tighter on the language used around what is a legitimate circumstance in which you can contact your employees. And finally, then, in terms of guidance to employers, it stipulates that where relevant, policies should address the issue of working across global time zones. In the public consultation on right to disconnect that was conducted here, this was one of the big issues that emerged, where employers and employer representatives were very keen to ensure that any measure, legislative or not, that was introduced would not go so far as to be seen as detrimental to the perceptions of flexibility in the Irish labour market or have a detrimental effect on our competitiveness or attraction of foreign direct investment. So ultimately, to finish, I want to look at the idea of the efficacy of the Code of Practice in the Irish context. The European Trade Union Congress and the European Trade Union Institute, when they talk about a code of practice or legislative approach to right to disconnect, they talk about evaluating it in three ways: the coverage of it, the enforcement of it, and its sufficiency in actually protecting workers. In terms of the coverage of the Irish Code of Practice, ultimately it covers everybody. It does not stipulate, like, for example, in the French case does, a minimum number of employees who have to be in an organisation to be covered by the code. The code covers everybody, it covers all organisations. However, on the other hand, one of the concerns in the Irish context, in the private sector at least, is the very low levels of collective bargaining coverage and low levels of union representation, which means that, ultimately what we might see is that this Code of Practice could be very significant in changing work cultures and in changing the approach to technology and digital connectivity in those recognised and unionised organisations, but in actual fact maybe have a very limited or inconsequential effect in organisations that do not have good bargaining coverage. The second issue then is around enforcement. So failure to follow this Code of Practice isn't an offence in itself. And I think Sacha referred to something like associated cases or associated issues here. And similarly, we do have in this context the ability through Section 29 of the Workplace Relations Act 2015 to actually submit as a piece of evidence a breach of a Code of Practice. So we already see that used quite a lot under something like the Code of Practice on grievance and disciplinary procedures. So in theory, if an employee were to bring, say, a constructive dismissal case under the Unfair Dismissals Act, they could absolutely submit as a piece of evidence suggesting that their employer had disregarded this Code of Practice or had simply paid lip service to this Code of Practice in their organisation. But in terms of its sufficiency, critics and criticisms of the Code of Practice would say that, rather than actually amending any legislation or introducing any new statutory footing, all of this Code of Practice has really done is consolidate fundamental parts of existing legislation. Other critics would go further and say that it actually hasn't taken into consideration enough actual workloads in organisations, that there's too much emphasis on contacting employees and not actually enough emphasis on the fact that employees are still maybe through technology engaging in work, not necessarily just contact with their employers outside of working time. And there are others who would go so far as to say that this Code of Practice has actually allowed for, I suppose, the dilution or the delegation of the right to disconnect to organisations rather than to the state or to legislation itself. So I suppose those who are advocates of the code of practice would say it's better than legislation, in that their argument is that the existing legislation already allows people to take cases. It already allows for people to exercise their rights under organisation of working time. And we did, before the introduction of this code, we did actually have some successful cases taken in that regard. There was a pretty significant case in 2018. So in terms of where to from here, definitely the code of practice has set the ball rolling in terms of cultural change in organizations. I think the idea of having a right to disconnect policy has moved from being something that's a nice to have, an add-on to your IT policy, to actually being something that is now seen as a must-have in organizations. And we're definitely seeing changes in terms of things like the introduction of email footers and, delayed notifications for sending of emails and so on. So has it been effective? I suppose in summation, somewhat. Is there more to do? Yes, I think there is. And I think that more to do might involve a European directive, or it might involve more specific amendment to something like either the Organisation of Working Time Act, or my own preference, maybe the Employment Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2018. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. That was fascinating and really nice to get an in-depth analysis of a country-specific code. So finally, before we pause for panel discussion and Q&A, we're going to go to Umberto. So Caroline, if you could stop screen sharing, and then Umberto, if you could start, that would be great.
Yes, I think my slides are with one of your teams, so they should appear autonomously.
Ah, yes.
But not sure, otherwise I can try. Oh, here you go, Megan. Thank you, Megan. Let me start. Sorry, I want to start with an apology to everyone. As I mentioned to the others earlier, I'm fairly under the weather, so apology if I sound a bit out of it. But to get started, the first thing I want to ask a question to everyone. Hello, by the way. And the question is, how many of you use the same phone for personal or work-related matters? And if you do, could you please use the reaction button at the bottom of the screen and raise your hand or anything, just to have a count of how, just an assessment of how many people do. I am one of those, I am afraid to admit. So quite a few. And this leads me to the first slides and some statistics. In fact, there was a Google study recently done that said that about 68% of employees surveyed in the United States use the same phone, and about the same amount end up accessing work-related applications in their spare time, which gives a bit of an idea of what the problem is in real terms. So why are we? What's this commission between private and work life? So just to go through what I want to discuss briefly, I will go briefly on why we are talking this moment of a right to disconnect, what's in it. Go through a few examples of legislation in Europe, so just give a broad overview of what are the experience. Some of the other speakers already touched on those, and just have a bit of an assessment of what has been working or what are the pitfalls in these legislations. So on why are we talking now about the right to disconnect? I guess the short answer is technology advances, as we just mentioned, mobile phones, and making everyone available all the time, and obviously the COVID pandemic that has pushed a switch to remote working, as everyone, I guess, have experienced in the past 2 years, and this resulted in people working more hours, according to the Eurofound research that someone already mentioned. In fact, almost 30% of home workers report working the free time, compared to 25% of people who work in the office. And people working from home are almost twice as likely to work over 48 hours a week. Why is this a problem? Besides the, let's say, concern related to salary and pay over time, there are a few reasons. First, that research and some scientific studies have shown that working too much basically is not good for your health. Overworking and lack of rest can lead to a series of ailments, including depression, anxiety, sleep impairment, and heart disease. So it goes beyond. Let's say, yes, it has a real impact on the lives of people. And other research also suggests that working too much, let's say, or people who overwork are not necessarily more productive, which means there is also a business case, if you want, for enabling people to disconnect, to rest in their spare time, because let's say working too much and disconnected, for example, to a blur in judgment, and also other problems with recognizing people's ability to recognizing in meetings face signals and in-person ability to communicate properly. So this is the issue, and that some governments, particularly in the last year, have been trying to address through legislation, which brings me to the next slide, which is an overview of what has been done in which countries in Europe so far. The first country to legislate in the area, I think, was France, which approved the law in 2016 and then came into force the year after. The French, let's say, right to disconnect, basically, as we heard previously, puts onus on employers to negotiate with union representatives. This in companies that I think are 50 or 35 employees or more, to negotiate basically an agreement on the right to disconnect and how that would work for workers, where an agreement cannot be reached, or there are probably the company still has to put up a charter that outlines what is being done and what are the principles that regulate the right to disconnect, let's say, in that establishment. As we heard, Belgium has a similar setup. Also in 2018, basically forces employers to consult an internal committee, so the Health and Safety Committee, which is made by employees, and they're to meet annually, I think, and discuss the use of digital tools and again, how the work and private life balance could be improved, but it doesn't have any strict enforcement, if I'm correct. Then more recently, Italy and Spain have similar cases. Italy only, though, related to this is called smart working, which in Italy basically means a hybrid work, so people who work sometime in the office and sometime remotely. There is a specific right to disconnect for them, but not for everyone else. And this translates usually in more details being then evened out in collective agreements at time of when these are negotiated between companies and unions. Then this year there has been a surge in this type of legislations. We heard about Ireland just now from Caroline. Greece, I think in August or this summer, passed quite a wide-reaching labor law, which included a right to disconnect, alongside some other controversial measures, like the possibility for workers to decide to work more hours one day and then take a day off, or work less the next day, or another day, which was criticized by unions. Also this year, I think, sorry, just a few weeks ago, Portugal obviously is the latest case, and which is quite interesting because Portugal went a bit a different way. So instead of establishing a right to disconnect, they banned employers from contacting their employees after hours, which I guess it's quite new legislation, so it would be interesting to see how that plays out in the future, but seem to be the strictest, let's say, legislation among those that have been passed in Europe. Then there are other experience, obviously, we heard how the EU Parliament backed, basically asked the Commission to come up with a directive on the right to disconnect. Ontario in Canada, the state just passed also legislation on the right to disconnect, I think last month. There is something similar that is in discussion in the Netherlands. So there is quite a movement that is gathering behind this issue. Which brings me to the last part, which was a bit of an assessment of what I've seen during my reporting on this topic of how does it work and whether these legislations are effective or not. And I think this is my personal take. I think a good example to try how things work in practice could be France, also because it's the first one that implemented this type of regulations. So famously, France has also, apart from this obligation to negotiate with unions, there is also a possibility for employees to sue their company if they are not granted the right to disconnect, or the right to disconnect is infringed. And it famously in 2018, the chemical company Rentokil was fined, I think, 60,000 euros for requiring a former employee to at the time when he was obviously employed by the company, to leave his phone always on and respond to calls. But at the same time, last year during the pandemic, a union that represents engineers, managers, and tech workers ran a survey across their, let's say, base and found that 80% of workers, despite having on paper a right to disconnect, didn't really enjoy any such thing while working from home during the pandemic, which is quite a striking figure. Almost everyone ended up working more and after hours in either case. This is to say that I think legislation per se are not like a silver bullet. They cannot fix the issue and grant automatically a better balance between work and private life. This has to come from the companies themselves, because as I think one French representative of the company union representative told me, you can have the most beautiful charter on the right to disconnect, but if no one does anything about it, it just hangs on the wall and that's it. And nothing really happens. At the same time, I think it's important that these legislations are brought forward, or passed, or there's a discussion about them, because it initiates change. It allows, it starts a conversation about this, and it forces, if you want, some company to have a look at their practices and potentially change the way work is done within their institutions. That's it. I try to be quick. Hopefully, I'll pass it back to Esme.
Thank you, Umberto. Thank you to all of our speakers there. It would be great to launch into some questions. So if anyone would either like to raise their hand or type into the chat, that would be great. And if you're able to and would like to share your camera view now, that would be great, just so it kind of feels like we're having a bit more personal discussion. So I'll start off. I've got a question for Andrew, I think, to begin with. You're clearly an advocate of the legislative approach in the UK, and I just wondered, as a union man, and why that is in comparison to some of the European approaches that focus more on the collective bargaining.
Yeah, I think it's the reality of the UK labour market. Outside of public services, I think unionisation rates are 16% in the private sector. So I think it's how do you get a balance between good initiatives through collective bargaining and scale. And I think it reflects the different labour markets we're in. So for instance, talking to friends in Scandinavia, to some extent, the idea of a right to disconnect policy is slightly alien, because they have such a high level of social partnership that actually the issues around workload, work culture, job design already have an institutional expression between the social partners. In the UK, we're one step closer to the Wild West of the US adversarial labour market. So for us, we will continue to negotiate through collective bargaining, but we think there should be an obligation on employers so that this can come at scale if we are to fix this kind of new working patterns in a way that works for the largest number of people.
That's great, thank you, Andrew. And I'm just waiting for some hands to go up, but I'll ask a question to Umberto. You mentioned the possibility of an EU directive. I suppose, what do you think the likelihood is of that coming to fruition, and is there any sign of movement on that front?
Good question. To be honest, I haven't followed the European directive in the last period, so I'm not sure what the latest development is. I know that by nature of what has been passed, the Commission will have to say something or do something about it. So the likelihood of having some work at least done on it, it's high. How that will come about is a question. The Parliament listed a series of requirements that they think the Commission should address through it. But then it's up to the Commission, the European Union legislative processes can be quite laborious sometimes. I think overall the topic is quite popular, and it's one that can win also quite consensus among the population. Is one thing that no one will ever say, no, I don't want a right to disconnect, I want to work all evening. So I think the likelihood of seeing something just because of the nature of what is being done is quite good, because it's a positive thing that could have a good impact also just for PR reasons. Whether what the contents will be is another matter.
Thanks, Umberto. And I'm going to go to Sacha next. And you talked a little bit about current UK employment law, and I'm just wondering, would there be any grounds at the moment or any law that could potentially support an employee complaint against an employer for overwork or expectations around connection?
I'm sorry, was that a question for me? My connection cut out there for me.
Yeah, sorry. It was just whether any of the current UK legislation could support or give grounds for an employee to make a complaint about expectations around working hours and connectivity.
Yeah, so in terms of obviously what I went through with the Health and Safety at Work Act and working time regs as well, but they only go so far, and I think that to get a breach of the Health and Safety at Work regs is quite a high threshold, and also obviously generally stress at work claims and things like that are quite difficult to bring. So I think there's been we saw actually during the pandemic a lot of employees were quite interested in sort of what claims they could bring for health and safety breaches around sort of coronavirus related breaches. So I think if there was a right to disconnect, I think there would be a real engagement with that, because at the moment it's quite unclear, the extent that current legislation would actually go to protect that, unless it sort of manifests itself into sort of a mental health issue, which then goes into being a disability, and you can go down the route of discrimination. Or in fact, obviously, if there is there's an implied breach of trust and confidence in every employment contract. So an employee is entitled to claim constructive unfair dismissal if they consider that actually the effect of the employee's breach has been so much that their trust and confidence has been affected, and they've had no alternative but to hand in their notice. But it's a risky claim, because obviously you're then having to hand in your notice and sort of be unemployed for the foreseeable future. So it's right to disconnect would really just sort of crystallise that and ensure that there's another course for action as well.
That's great, thank you. And I think that's touched upon the kind of question / comment in the chat from Lucienne Morandi, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, about the risks for workers of taking these sorts of complaints up with employers. So I'm just going to go to Caroline now, again on the sort of specific legislation. You mentioned one that you had preference for amending, and I'm just wondering why that is, and what sort of things you look for in a piece of legislation that make it ripe for change.
Well, I suppose we already had a case taken under the Organisation of Working Time Act 1997 in 2018. And in that case, it was interesting because the employee wasn't necessarily claiming that her employer was trying to contact her outside of working hours. What she ultimately was just doing was using her existing records of working time to show that she had been responding to emails, sending emails, and that her employer had seen emails coming from her outside of working time. So what she was able to do there was show that there was not sufficient recording of her working time going on, and that was the employer's responsibility. So in that instance, I think if there were a specific reference made within that act to right to disconnect, more employees would see and understand their ability to take a case in that regard. The other piece of legislation, apologies, the office phone keeps ringing. The other piece of legislation that I talked about is the Employee Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2018. And the reason why I suggest that one is because it's the most recent of all of them to have been amended. And somebody really wants to reach me. The reason why that one I pointed out, it was recently amended in 2018, and it was done so in reaction to 0 hours contracts. And of course, when we think about it, it was one of the last very big issues in the Irish labour market, or in the UK labour market as well, before right to disconnect. It was this whole idea of casualisation of employment. And there was a stipulation put into that where employers now have to give employees, I suppose, a contract or a recommendation around what is considered a legitimate expectation of their contract. So if you're going to be working 8 hours a week, 10 hours a week, 15 hours a week, whereas in the past, under 0 hours, for example, employees would have had, very little understanding of their actual working hours. The same argument could be made for putting in a provision around expectations around disconnect. So for example, if a particular organisation were to say, at end of quarter periods, we envisage that there may be a possibility where we will require connectivity outside of standard working hours. Well, maybe that's feasible and practical. But this idea that it can happen anytime, anywhere, I think there should be a little bit more prescriptiveness around that.
That's brilliant, thank you. And just to sort of bring it back to the UK context for a moment then, Andrew, I wonder if you could speak to what you envisage sort of, or what your preference would be for the next steps in a pursuit of some UK-wide legislation.
Yeah, and I think I very much agree that I don't see the right to disconnect as a silver bullet. It's not a policy in isolation. I think we have upended our economic model significantly during the pandemic. We have proved that we can keep people safe, connected, and working whilst not being attached specifically to a location in the same way we have in the past. So I'm really interested in how we make this part of what do new working patterns and flexible work look like. So we advance it in that spirit. So in terms of negotiating with employers, we would negotiate or think around disconnect policies as part of what does flexible working look like from a worker perspective. And that will include all sorts of boundaries and reflections around accessing services, paid remuneration, hours, shift patterns, the whole bundle of things that make that work. In terms of legislation, we will still articulate and still lobby to government and devolve governments around them taking a leadership role about obliging companies to negotiate this. And I think in a UK setting, our preference would be, or we think the most realistic option is to leave that content to a negotiation between employers and their unions or workforce. But we also see it alongside the sense of digital rights that we'd like to see there. I think there's a real absence of digital or data rights in the work sphere, and our lessons the last 2 years have proved that the capability of digital technology is transforming how people are managed, how we work, the types of jobs, and we often talk about skills and automation when it comes to government policy. I think respecting privacy and rights, autonomy, agency for individuals is really important within that. So they kind of go together. And I think that the most positive area we've got is that we know there is public interest in this. Definitely member interest. The two recent stories we've had on the BBC, both on right to disconnect and on surveillance, have been some of the most popular stories the BBC have run, running into millions of people reading them, because we know it touches this sense that many people feel there's been big benefits, but there's actually a downside that we need to talk about in terms of this future world of work. But also it's to do with well-being. And actually, I say it's like the Mars bar slogan: it's work, rest, and play. We actually, people work, we don't work, but actually, good life is about doing good things when you're not working. It's not just the absence of work. And how do we get into that? And if you think the figures before the last year, before the pandemic, we lost around 18 million working days in the UK due to stress and anxiety. I think this new form of digital stress is going to be one of the big challenges, and employers can either lean into it and solve it, or we're going to end up picking up the pieces down. So, we think there's a case for business to be adopting good disconnect policies as well as part of good data policies to ensure that we're all getting something out of this, because it's grown to that size of a challenge.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really useful. Unless anyone has anything to come in, I think would be quite a nice way to wrap up. It's odd to finish a meeting early, but I think there's been a chance for good discussion. We've heard some various views, and just thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to our fantastic speakers. Just a direction to our next Digit Debates event, which is happening next week on the 1st of December with Sana Oyenpera, Skills for the Planetary Labour Market, Indian Workers in the Platform Economy. So we'll hopefully see you again next week. Do keep in touch with us via the Digit website and Twitter. I know Gemma's put some links in the chat. And yeah, thank you everybody, and I hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.